Good afternoon and good evening in Greece to everyone that's joining us this afternoon. I'm Drake Barakis, Chair of the National Hellenic Society, and it's my pleasure to bring you another one of our weekly series, NHS Talks. And this week, it's a pleasure to actually look at Greece over time. Certainly, we know we're all anticipating next year the great celebration, 200 years since Greek independence, since the War of Independence. And so we felt at some point this year, it'd be great to have a discussion, not primarily just on the War of Independence, but really what happened to Greece post-war, and also, bringing it up to the modern Greek state of today, and so we want to talk about a lot of time, but we'll stay focused and try to stay on top of the main topics or the main points in history. But so 2 centuries of both triumphs and tragedies. I think for those of us here in the United States and the diaspora, obviously know very well, we're very well educated on ancient Greece and what the world was provided as gift from our ancient Greeks, philosophers, historians, scientists, the works. And then, of course, we all learn about the Greek War of Independence and the freedom from the Ottoman Empire. But for a lot of us that live here in the States, now it's much easier, certainly in the technology age, to stay on top of what's happening on a daily basis. But really, up until before the internet, it was challenging to really find out and know what was going on. At least on a day-to-day basis, overall, we have a good sense. But so I wanted to bring and introduce to you our speaker today, our special guest, Dr. Haris Vlavianos of the American College of Greece. He's a professor there in politics and history. He's not only as a historian, but a very famous poet as well. And so he's going to walk us through, we'll have a little bit of a discussion over the 200 years evolution of the modern Greek state, and see how things have changed from the day the revolution set forth up until today. So with that, I will let you kick things off, Dr. Vlavianos.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
So why don't you walk us through some of the trials and tribulations since the War of Independence commenced?
Okay, well, first of all, since I'm speaking to mostly an American audience, I would like to say something about the Greek Revolution in comparison to the American one.
Yes.
Obviously, the American and the French Revolution were the 2 revolutions that inspired a number of revolutions, not just in Greece, but also in other European countries and in Latin America. The difference, of course, is that the Americans won their independence single-handedly, and they created a new country, a republic, with their own very strong constitution. The founding fathers worked and produced a very important document. Now, Greek independence was in many ways compromised. We won our independence through the intervention of the great powers, through the intervention of Britain, France, and Russia. And we began our life as an independent state with 2, as I would say, probably one tragic event and one bizarre event. The tragic event is that the first governor of Greece, Kapodistrias, was murdered in Nafplio in his effort to create a modern centralized state. And the bizarre point is that the great powers decided that Greece should be ruled by a Bavarian king, Otto, who on top of everything was also a Catholic. So the bizarre thing is that an Orthodox country was going to be ruled by a Bavarian Catholic king. That means that the independence, as I say, was not a kind of independence like the Americans celebrate their independence. The Greek independence was, as I said, in many ways compromised. The fact that Kapodistrias was actually murdered points to the difficulty of creating a modern state now that the Ottomans had actually left Greece. And for many Greeks at the time, when they used the word patrida, they meant their village or their locality. And something which is not very much discussed, and I don't think it will be discussed when we celebrate the 200 years of independence, is that during the War of Independence, we had a bloody civil war between different fractions of Greeks. And you would see that, for example, the Peloponnesians were actually slaughtering the people of Rumeli with greatest ferocity than they were actually slaughtering the Turks. So there were a lot of local interests, Peloponnesians or the island people or the people of Rumeli. And you find a number of alliances taking place during the War of Independence that sometimes, some historians, especially the left-wing historians who think that the civil wars were, on the one hand, the chieftains, the leaders of the war, the warlords versus the landowners. This is completely wrong, because you find a leader like Kolokotronis in alliance with Petrobis Mavromichalis, who was the big man in Peloponnesos, against, of course, the people of the islands, Hydra, or the people of Thessalia. So, and the first three parties that were created in Greece were called the British, the French, and the Russian. So, which means that the parties were not actually built on ideologies and platforms, but rather they were built around personalities who had a protecting power in their back. So, for example, Mavrokordatos was the representative of the British party. Koletis was the representative of the French party. And those who felt that religion was very important, of course, they were looking to Russia for protection. So in that sense, as I say, independence was won, and it was a great event. But on the other hand, there were a number of things that were not very clear. What country Greece was going to become? Was it going to become a westernized country? I mean, the constitutions that were created during the revolution, of course, they were copying the French constitution. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, that was the point. But on the other hand, how do you change a society that for 400 years has been living in a specific way? And don't forget that for many Greeks, a centralized state meant, a state like the one run by the Sultan, who imposed taxes on the Greeks. We still, as you know, in modern Greek, we use the word charatsi whenever we think that the government is imposing taxes on us which are not very fair. So the word charatsi comes from that time. And, how do you allow people to, how do you persuade people that you need a kind of different kind of state? And one of the problems that, for example, one finds in the 19th century is brigandry. A lot of people continue to live like brigands, like the way they lived. We use the word, for example, in Greek, kleftes και armatoli, as one word. But what exactly is kleftes and armatoli? Well, these were people who, for example, were klefts. I mean, they were living by raiding villages and stealing things. They lived in the mountains. Then they became armatoli when they worked in the services of Ali Pasha. So they could change sides very easily. And we know that during the War of Independence, again, a lot of heroes did this very famous, the Greek word is kapakia. They made arrangements with the Turks in order to attack another kind of Greek band. And during the 19th century, you had a lot of brigands making their money and living in that kind of way. So why I'm saying that, if you have people who prefer that kind of life, how do you create a national army? How would the guy who's been, who has this kind of life, allow himself or agree to actually be part of a kind of national army? So the development of Greece was very difficult. Now, what united the Greeks, and this is one strategy that Otto, with his prime minister Koletis, came up with in order to unite the Greeks around the palace, was the great idea, η μεγάλη ιδέα, the idea that Greece should expand, should include all the Greeks that lived outside the kingdom, because the kingdom at the time of its creation was pretty small. So you had a lot of areas like Epirus, Macedonia, the islands, and of course, for some people, the dream was also Constantinople. So the Megali there was something that went through many phases, but was something that somehow a lot of politicians used it as, in order to create some kind of loyalty and cohesion, and that would somehow give some prestige to the king. But this idea, the Megali there, if one goes forward, I mean, we had some moments of triumphs. For example, you mentioned the Balkan Wars, and we were very fortunate because through the Balkan Wars, we gained 51% of the area, which was Macedonia. But unfortunately, the great idea ended with a catastrophe, which is the catastrophe of Smyrna in 1922. And we lost all our presence in Asia Minor, and about 1.5 million refugees actually had to flee Asia Minor and the Pontus area and arrive in Greece. So I think that, the beginnings were, as I say, pretty anomalous, how this country actually began its life. And gradually, through the 19th century, Greece is trying to modernize, to become like a Western state, but there were many obstacles in its efforts to do so.
Let me ask you a question. What was, and I just want to step back briefly because you gave us a great detail in terms of what Greece was like post-independence or at the start of the independence. But being under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, what was the Greek identity in general? It sounds like it was fragmented. So if you were Greek living in Thessaloniki, or Greek living in Karditsa, or in Athens, or in Crete, or Sparti.
Well, that's
I mean,
that's an interesting.
Did you have an? I mean, did you still identify, even though you're historically Greek, but did you actually? I mean, were you free to interact, or was that regionalization continuing on from centuries ago?
No, for example, if one goes even as late as 1817, and you go to the area of Macedonia, which became an area where three countries were competing for influence, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, before the Bulgarians actually created their own church, the Exarchate, and began to proselytize the locals there. If you'd ask a person who lived in Macedonia to identify himself, he would probably identify himself by religion. In other words, Christian versus Muslim.
Right.
And religion was very important for a number of people. But if you come to the kingdom, I suppose for many people, the first thing they would say is probably, as you said, the locality, where they came from, whether they were a Peloponnesian or they came from Hydra or Spetses or Thessaly. The concept of patrida, the fatherland or the motherland, began to develop slowly. It did begin to develop during the revolution for some people, but one has to be very careful about how the intellectuals, those people like Korais and Rigas Ferreos, for example, discuss patrida, or the people from Fanari, like Mavrokordatos, the Fanariotes, who were intellectuals, well educated. I mean, obviously they had, when they talked about Greece, they had the concept of patrida that you're probably inferring to. But for other people, this wasn't very clear. They were more bound to their locality. Even today, Drake, if people in Greece, sometimes you hear old people say, θέλω να πάω να πεθάνω στην πατρίδα μου. I want to go and die in my patria, and they mean their village.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that idea began to develop gradually, but it wasn't very clear, in the beginning. And even as late as 1870 in Macedonia, a lot of people would identify themselves as Christians versus Muslims. If you read the memoirs of Makrigiannis, is one of the heroes of the Greek Revolution.
Right.
In the memoirs, Makrigiannis always, many times, refers to the Turks as the apisti, the infidels. So he had, there's like kind of the war of independence for Makrigiannis in many passages, like a kind of jihad. It's like a religious war between Christian Orthodox versus Muslims.
And I think we also have to understand too how Europe changed, or Europe was changing in the 1800s, early 1800s to the 1900s. The British Empire was peaking, was slowing down, so to speak, losing its influence. The Ottoman Empire, of course, was declining at that point. But the Russian Empire was building. The German, as you mentioned, the German Empire was strong. So I think we
were very fortunate in what sense? When the War of Independence began in 1821, this is 6 years after the Congress of Vienna, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and there was a holy alliance in Europe, and all the great powers, the five great powers of Europe, didn't want any trouble. I mean, they had suffered 25 years of war from the French Revolution, 1789 to 1815. And the fact that the Greek Revolution actually was allowed to go on, and finally the British in 1823 through Canning recognized the right of the Greeks to rebel against the Ottomans, this is a miracle. that they were able to sustain themselves for so long until finally one great power came to its assistance. And then the other two came in because they didn't want to lose, Greece and some influence in the Mediterranean. But we were also fortunate, if I can mention that, is that the first year of the revolution, the Turks, the Ottomans were busy fighting Ali Pasha. So I think that, if you discuss the Greek Revolution, we had great assistance from this man who decided to have his own war with the Sultan. And so we had 1 year in which we were left, alone, to start the revolution and build up. But the revolution would have ended when the forces of Ibrahim landed in the Peloponnese if it wasn't for the intervention of the great powers. So, as I said at the beginning, we were fortunate, but on the other hand, our independence was in many ways compromised.
Sure. After King Otto, Bavaria, how did, in terms of the timeline, how did the English monarchy get? Was it through marriage, through acquisition?
No,
how did they?
English. The second king after Otto was Bavarian, and in a way he wasn't. I mean, he grudgingly gave a constitution, but he never respected the constitution. So the Greeks were fed up, and he had to go, and he was replaced by George, who came from the Danish throne, Glitzberg. So the Greeks wanted, they wanted the second son of Queen Victoria, but obviously the other great powers wouldn't allow Greece to have such a strong connection with the British. So the solution was this Danish king. Now, George was more clever than Otto, because he ruled at the beginning like Otto, but then something happened. We were lucky because at the end of the 19th century, we had a great politician that came to the surface, and this is Trikoupis, Harillos Trikoupis, who tried to modernize Greece. And Trikoupis at some point wrote an article, an anonymous article, in which it's a famous article in the Greek Times, Ikeri, in which the title of the article is "Tis Ptei," who is responsible, who is to blame. And basically what he was saying in this article is that the political instability in Greece is that the king can appoint and dismiss ministers, can close parliament, and therefore political parties are just, again, they're not platforms, they're just individuals who are trying to get, the kind of the support of the king to be nominated as ministers or prime ministers. And they didn't know who wrote the article, so the editor was arrested, and then finally Trikoupis came up and said, I did it, I wrote the article. He was already a minister. And the king, and in the article, Trikoupis argued that if you want political stability in Greece, the king should always appoint as prime minister the person who enjoys the majority in parliament. The the expressed will of the people as reflected in parliament. And George was clever enough to do that. So after that, George always appointed prime ministers who enjoyed the support of the majority in parliament. The unfortunate thing about Trikoupis is that Trikoupis tried to modernize Greece, and the modernization, of course, meant that he had to borrow money, loans, and he had to raise taxation, which was very unpopular. And his opponent was a man called Vlavianos, a populist guy, who got elected on the ticket that he would always decrease taxation. So, and he was always a man who, he said once in parliament that if Trikoupis says that, like, now it's night, he would say that it's day. So everything that Trikoupis did, Vlavianos undid. So we spent the last 25 years of the 19th century with these two politicians coming and going, and no great effort was, there were some things were done, for example, the opening of the Corinth Canal and things like that. But at some point, Greece had to declare bankruptcy because they wouldn't be able to pay. Greece was very poor. It was the whole economy was depending on 3 or 4 major products like tobacco and currents and oil, which were luxury products. And if the world prices decline, then the whole economy is destroyed. And so, again, the economy was destroyed, the country was bankrupt. Vlavianos tried to bypass this problem by declaring war on Turkey in 1897. In Thessaly, we lost the war. And I think, the 19th century closed with tremendous disappointment. The Megali there was not progressing. The Greek economy was not actually functioning properly, but we have a new generation of people, 2 generations of people now that have been educated. They are the sons and the grandsons of the heroes of the Greek independence. So they're looking at Europe. They want a different kind of Greece. They have different expectations. And these expectations, I think one has to wait until 1910, these expectations materialized in the person of Eleftherios Venizelos. So that brings us to the 20th century.
Right. And that's probably, for a lot of us, that's when our forefathers, whether it's in my family, would be my paternal grandparents, late 1800s, early 1900s, because of the situation in Greece, they decided to, look for a better life, and they started, their life journey to the United States.
Immigration was always a safe valve. So whenever there were troubles, especially, the end of the 19th century, World War I, people would immigrate, and they had a very hard life, but as you know very well, better than I think the story of the Greeks in America is a story of success.
Right.
Great success.
Right. And we know about the Greeks that left for the United States, for Canada, Australia, other places.
Was amazing, which I actually learned quite recently by studying, is that the Greeks who arrived in America at the beginning of the 20th century were heavily discriminated, like the blacks and other minorities. And in fact, the Ku Klux Klan targeted also people from the South, like from Greece and Italy. And the image that the Americans had of the Greeks changed drastically because of World War II and the fact that the Greek armies defeated Mussolini in the War of 1940. But until 1940, when the Greeks suddenly became heroes for everyone, the image that a lot of Americans had about the Greeks was, to say the least, extremely negative.
Right. Absolutely true. How did the start? Let's talk about the start of the 20th century now. Obviously, you had the economy was in tough shape. The country was bankrupt.
Is a century of triumphs and setbacks. As I said, Venizelos was, he arrived in Greece. He was a great politician from Crete. There was a military coup in 1909 in Goudi. It started, the military raised on purely military questions, but then they decided that the establishment, the old Tajaki, as we say, the old political system was completely corrupt, and all the dreams that people had about the new Greece could not be fulfilled with the existing political personnel. So they invited Venizelos, who was a very able politician in Crete, to take over. He did. He created a liberal party. He was a man who definitely wanted to change Greece. He did something that Trikoupis had not done. He did the agrarian, he brought, the agrarian reform to break up the great estates and distribute land to the peasants. And of course, he was the architect during the Balkan Wars, which of course meant that Greece, as I said at the beginning, was able to gain Epirus and 51% of the area of Macedonia. And this was a great victory because the country that had great expectations and had shown its kind of aggressive policies was Bulgaria. And finally, Bulgaria, through the Second Balkan War, had to admit defeat, and all the dreams of taking Salonika and extending its territory to the Aegean, all this dream was completely frustrated. And this is due to Venizelos. Unfortunately, this moment of triumph was to be followed by one of great division in Greece, and this was the result of different policies that King Constantine and Venizelos had during World War I. This is the period of the Great Schism, the Megalo Schisma, and this is related to the policies that the two men wanted Greece to follow during World War I. Venizelos, who had very close connection with the British, wanted Greece to join the Entente. He was expecting that we would win the war, that he would be on the right side. And of course, the dream of Venizelos was, within the Megali Idea, to take Smyrna, the enclave of Smyrna, and perhaps, at some point, Constantinople. Constantine was married to Sophia, who was the sister of the Kaiser. He couldn't actually express his Germanophile sentiments, but he wanted Greece to remain neutral. Now, I don't want to bore you with details, but at the end of the day, Constantine was forced to leave Greece. Venizelos became prime minister. After having created his own government in Salonika, Greece also went through a period of acute division, almost resembling a civil war again. So again, we were fighting World War I, but again, we had the civil war. Finally, Greece joined the correct side. We joined the Entente, and At the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles, Greece was given the prize. You know, we were given through the Treaty of Sèvres, we got everything that Greece wanted, with the exception of Northern Cyprus. And we got Smyrna for 5 years to administer Smyrna. And the agreement was that in 1925, there would be a referendum. And if people wanted to join Greece, to unite with Greece, then this would happen. And Venizelos was confident that this will happen. But then sometimes, you know, there are factors in history that nobody controls. I mean, they are kind of like the assassination of Kennedy, unexpected events. And the unexpected event is that Constantine left Greece. He was replaced by his second son, Alexander. And Alexander was bitten by a monkey and he died. And the elections that were fought in November 1920 became suddenly a contest between Venizelos and the royalists. And Venizelos, to everybody's surprise, lost. So the king came back. He continued as a minor kind of expedition, and which ended in, as I said, a total disaster. The good thing about, the only positive thing about the Asia Minor catastrophe, one has to say that, is that half of the refugees that came to Greece decided to go to Salonika and Macedonia, which meant that Macedonia was, after the refugees actually went there, was Hellenized. The proportions of the Greeks in Macedonia, the census changed completely. I mean, before the Greeks were not in great numbers in Macedonia. After the refugees arrived in Greece and settled in Macedonia, so half of them, you have the Hellenization of Macedonia. So in that sense, there was one positive effect of the catastrophe. One can say that my yaya was from Smyrna, and she came in 1922. So I know quite these people had to suffer when they came to Greece. But don't forget that many of the Greeks of Smyrna, they arrived in Greece like Onassis and entrepreneurs and writers and poets, and they changed the life of Greece. They brought, even sometimes when people say Greek food and they enjoy Greek food, we have to remember that this food was brought from Anatolia, from those Anatolian Greeks, and the music, of course.
What was the political system in Greece then as it was under the monarchs?
Well,
I mean, what were the parties?
Well, you had the Venizelos on the one hand, and you had the royalists, the conservative party on the other hand. And that's, again, it's in a way resembles the Trikoupis Deligiannis kind of fight, modernization, westernization versus, policies that would keep Greece, back. And, there were forces of reaction, let's say. The problem with King Constantine and with kings in general is that it was never very clear what were the prerogative of an elected prime minister versus the king. I mean, for example, during World War I, who is responsible to actually decide on foreign policy? The elected prime minister, Venizelos, or the king? You see, that's a big thing. Something that, of course, in America you never face as a problem. During the 20th century, in the 19th century, we had two problems that we don't have now. We don't have now after the fall of the junta. One is the constitutional question. And the second is, we haven't discussed that, but the second, one of the biggest problems in Greece was the intervention of the army as a parastate, as a kind of force which operates outside parliament and intervenes at many moments in Greek history, establishing dictatorships. We had the dictatorship, a big one, from 1936 to 1940, the famous or infamous Metaxas dictatorship, and then one that a lot of Americans probably know, the Colonels, from 1967 to 74. But we had other dictators. We had one in 26 with Pangalos, one with Pomvilis in 35. We had attempted coup d'etats in 33, 35 by Plastiras in favor of Venizelos. So, the army always was there. Venizelos was brought in by coup d'etat in Roudi. But the good thing about that 1909 putsch was that the army, very rarely in its history showed self-restraint. And once Venizelos was invited to come to Greece, the army left. But usually when the army attempted a coup d'etat, then, they took power in their own hands. So after 74, the constitutional question was ended because now Greece it's a parliamentary democracy without a king, and nobody in Greece at the moment is afraid that the army may engage in the activities that were engaging in the past, or even entertain ideas of interfering in the political system. So these two problems, which we had in Greece for almost 2 centuries, is finished.
But what was the economic conditions back early days in the 20s?
Well, basically, Greece was an agrarian society, slowly industrializing. And I think the great success story is that the Greeks became very good merchants, and they built one of the most important fleets. So in that sense, the strong point of Greece was the commerce. We were very good in that. But industrialization proceeded, but as I said, in a slow pace. It began to take more on after the 1950s. Don't forget that we lost a lot of time because the Americans had the Civil War, but this was in the 19th century. We had the Civil War in 1946-49. We had the dictatorship from 1936 to 1940. We had the Great Schism during World War I. Now, this kind of cleavages, this kind of great divisions, retarded development. I mean, they put the country back. And Greece we lost 10 years. The first years because of the occupation and the war, 1940 to 1945. And then we had the third round of civil war from 46 to 49. The country was totally devastated. So, that kind of development we went back. I mean, it was retarded. So we start again. We never had a normal process. The country united around a plan. And going back to your question, I think economic development, of course, was either accelerated with good politicians, or it went back because of political developments.
And it's interesting to say that. I mean, you really have not found in the early development of let's say the first 50 to 100 years since the War of Independence, that stability, as you're saying. You had some good periods, some bad periods, but there was always ongoing divisions. You had the struggle between the monarchy and the prime minister.
I tell you one positive thing, although some may disagree with me, and I'm sorry to say that, but I say that as mostly as a historian of political science. I'm completely amazed by what is happening in America now with the elections. The election result and the refusal of Trump to accept defeat. And if I want to say something about success stories, that despite divisions, parliamentary democracy in Greece since 1974 operates extremely smoothly. There is a exchange of power. Whoever wins the elections is enthroned. And we never had any problem with elections and how democracy functions. Of course, we had divisions. We went through Brexit. We had troubles in the last couple of years. Huge economic problems, great divisions again, and confrontations. But on the other hand, even at the kind of lowest possible moment of a crisis, democracy functions. Whereas in America, which is supposed to be, the example of democracy, we finally see that. I've been following what has happened since the elections. Actually, I gave a talk at the college with a colleague of mine about the November 3rd elections, predicting what will happen. And, we were predicting that Trump will lose. But I could never predict that this man will lose and then will create such, Biden has such a big problem now because he's going to, he's going to lead the country where 70 million people think that the elections were rigged. And since we were talking about cleavages and divisions in Greece, we're now in 2020, 21, Biden will take over. What kind of country is going to lead? When people go out in the streets, and 2 days ago I saw in the BBC, there were clashes in Washington between supporters of Trump and supporters of Biden. This is unheard of in a democracy that, there is no smooth transfer of power. So in that sense, I could say that the Greeks were more successful in terms of how the democratic system works.
And at the same time, it's been for a lot of us here that have, it's been to some extent a great civics lesson for all of us, to really understand what the process is like. I mean, certainly, you know, like you said, we're a very divided country here in the United States, probably more divided than we ever have been.
Yeah.
You know, we've had moments where we do, at the end of the day, we do come together, but yeah, it's a tall task for the next administration, for Biden and his party, to find ways to reunite the country, so to speak. You know, we've had, you know, you go back in time and see, you know, when things were you know, at their best. But yeah, certainly I know that it's been an interesting question across the entire
Yeah,
world.
I don't want, you know, to say that the Greeks were in many ways are different from the Americans. I mean, there are certain similarities. We also have a history of populist leaders who, in many ways, create these divisions, and they lie. You know, I mean, you can say that a lot of politicians lie, but I mean, there's an extent of lying, and there are some politicians. I mean, I don't know if it's true, but I read there was statistics in the New York Times or in the Washington Post that Trump lies 6 times a day. Well, 6 times a day is a world record for lying for a politician, also as a president. So we had our share of populist leaders, even recently, and the country was actually going to the rocks with Brexit. And there was a lot of lying at the time and a lot of divisions. But, you know, as I said, we had the elections and things changed. And when we will have the next elections again, I mean, the process is very smooth, despite all the problems we have. I'm very saddened to see what's happening at the moment in the States with because, you know, democracy in the States is so strong, and people actually look up to America. When the question about liberalism and democracy come up, they always think about constitution and how the system works there. So in that sense, there are certain similarities with America. We had our share of populist leaders. I mentioned Vlavianos, of course. I could mention another populist leader, since we're talking about the 20th century. I think Andreas Papandreou did a lot of damage, if I can say that, because although he was very bright and he was raised in America, he was a great economist. He was obviously, you know, he had the flair to be a politician, and people were expecting from him, the slogan of Papandreou and his party was "Αλλαγή," change. People were expecting a lot of him, and he had the power to do that. And unfortunately, he wasted a lot of that power into polarizing Greek society. And one of the phenomena we had at the time, one of the bad effects was, well, now we're used to the term, we're using the term fake news. But Papandreou had his own newspaper called Avriani, created a kind of a sick situation called Avrianismos, where, you know, there were lies circulating in the system almost every day. And so I think he had an opportunity, a great opportunity, where people were, you know, there was so much eager for change, and he lost it. So, you know, that's another kind of loss that we went through. But again, even with Papandreou, you know, the process, as I said, Papandreou gave power to Mitsotakis, the father, and then Mitsotakis lost the elections, and it goes on like that. We are expecting things, and I think, since I mentioned Papandreou, the other man one has to mention is Karamanlis, and I think Karamanlis, if we are looking at posterity, I think Karamanlis always comes out as the best politician, the most wise one. I'm talking about Karamanlis the first, who decided that Greece should be part of the European family, should be part of NATO, and I think, as far as the European nation, the European kind of family, I think that's very, very important. I mean, Greece now with COVID, we are getting all this assistance because we are part of the European Union. If Greece had left the European Union as the old party wanted, I mean, it would have been alone now. We'd probably be a country like Venezuela at the moment. Our economy would be completely shattered. So in that sense, I'm glad that the ex-prime minister, the last minute, did a volte-face of 180 degrees and decided that Greece should stay in the European Union, because that's the family we should belong. And that is credited to Karamanlis, and with the assistance of the man who died recently, the French President Giscard d'Estaing, who actually helped very much the Greeks to be part of that union. I mentioned before something that it's interesting. You mentioned the question of identity, and despite the fact that they said that we belong to Europe, don't forget that in the referendum, 60% of the Greeks voted for Greece to leave Europe. And that is a very sad effect. You can say that this was a momentous reaction, and they don't really want that. But a lot of Greeks actually, they don't feel part of Europe. And that's why sometimes you hear even politicians say, "I Evropi," as if we're not part of Europe. Of course, if somebody comes up and writes an article and says that we are not part of Europe, people will get very offended because they will say, "Ah, yes, but we created Europe, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all that story." But there are a lot of people who actually see themselves mostly part of as being closer to the Balkans, and they stress religion, Orthodoxy, Russia, etc., and the East, Anatolia, rather than the West. So I think the majority of the Greeks are very happy to be, as I said, in that European family, but there are still Greeks who speak about Europe as if Greece is not part of Europe, as if something else, there's another continent there, okay? So, you know, in that sense, identity is not something settled yet.
And we also, you know, there's been a lot of good relations with the diaspora, but also in general with the United States, you know, the last few plus years, and that seems to be going extremely well. Well, I'm curious, you know, you mentioned the older generation, you know, how does the let's say the younger generation, those that are coming out of the Greek universities and colleges today, how do they view kind of the world? You know, what do you see that this generation, the younger generation that's out there today, how do you see they want to make their mark, not only through the country, but through the world, you know, as being part of Europe, having close relationships with the US, with the diaspora?
You know, I teach at the American College. So obviously it's an American institution based in Greece, and we're a liberal college. That's very important to stress. We are a college that, you know, works in a very different way than the Greek university system. We provide a different kind of education. I've never lost a class in my life. I've been teaching there for 32 years. You know, my students have never lost a term, something that is very common in Greek university. We haven't been invaded, and students from, you know, outside, people can't actually get into the college and disrupt the work we do there. And I think that the college has a cosmopolitan kind of environment. We have students from many countries. Therefore, the education, which is very liberal, in combination and conjunction with the people you see around, I think creates students that are very open-minded, who see themselves mostly in cosmopolitan terms. Don't forget that the cosmopolitan word comes from Diogenes. When he was asked what is his country, he said, "I'm a politis to cosmo, I'm a citizen of the world." So I think that a lot of young people actually see themselves, they may have a root in Greece or whatever, but they can see their future either in America or in a European country. That doesn't mean that they forget that they're Greeks, but they see themselves, you know, operating in a much bigger context now. And that, I think, is very positive.
Right. The other thing too, which I think is important to say, as obviously you're involved, I'm involved as a trustee of the American College of Greece, is the parallel program, studies program, which allows, you know, a number of Greek students that are attending the public universities to either come to
that's
the
a
American
great
college.
Story,
yeah.
Because as you know, for many years, I mean, we still are not recognized by the official Greek state. That's a big fight, as you know, a big struggle that we're trying to change the perception. This is a law by, you know, this is such an old law that you cannot accept private education on the kind of university level, which is, it's totally bizarre, but I hope at some point the Greek state will realize how bizarre that is and how wrong it is, because you have private education on the school level, but you cannot have private education on the university level. But the parallel studies, as you said, it's a great success that shows that if people who actually get into the state university, they also come to us to get, you know, I wouldn't say better education, perhaps it's better, but also another kind of education to prepare themselves for their postgraduate studies, either in England or America or whichever place they're going to go. And I think, if I'm right with the statistics, I hope President Horner is not going to dispute me if he's watching. I think 1 out of 6 students is a parallel student, and 1 of 6 students is also a study abroad student. That's another success story. We have a lot of my classes in modern Greek history, Drake, are full of American students. They come to Greece for a term and they have a wonderful time. They you know, apart from the education, they get to know the country, and some of them will come back, definitely. to visit the country again. So that's also a great thing.
We've seen obviously a rise in nationalism in Europe, and what it's done. You think that's a trend that's going to continue, and how is it viewed from the perspective of Greece?
Yeah, I found Brexit as being something very, very bad. And my friends from England, the ones, because I lived in England for 11 years. I studied at Bristol and Oxford, so I have a lot of friends in England. And I don't know, you can say that my friends because we have similar views. Everybody hates Johnson, and I think the idea of Brexit is a catastrophe in a world where you have great powers like America and Russia and China. What's Britain going to do alone? I mean, the days of the empire is over. If Britain is going to do something, it's going to do it as part of the Union. I don't think that ex-communist countries want to join in, and they have to, and they have applied for membership. So I mean, there are some countries like Hungary or Orban, and that may be the the black sheep of Europe. But I think overall, I don't think I don't foresee that in the near future this kind of Europe that we're talking about is going to dissolve itself.
There's a lot politically, and I'm trying to look at it more from a historical perspective. But any lessons we can learn going forward between the intricacies? We know what the relations are between Greece
but on the other hand,
Turkey.
But on the other hand, Putin is a dictator. So
right.
If you're a Democrat, if you are a person who respects democracy, he cannot be a very appealing figure. So I don't think that orthodoxy matters in this instance. I mean, he's a dictator, okay? And anybody who's against him, he found himself shot in a bridge or in his house. And I'm not talking about mending in the American elections. The way he sees himself and how he rules Russia, but also in terms of culture. I mean, there's some kind of stupid anti-Americanism in Greece. On November 17, there are still some people who go outside the embassy.
Right.
In fact, it was very funny because Obama was very popular in Greece, extremely popular. The Greeks loved Obama. And he came to Greece November 15, gave a lecture at the Niarchos Foundation, left November 16. And then on November 17, the day after Obama left, people were, again, outside the American embassy shouting against because of the junta period, because of the Nixon-Kissinger involvement during the junta period and the invasion of Cyprus. But on the other hand, if we look at culture, now that we are in our houses, locked down, what do most Greeks do? They watch Netflix. How do they communicate? What kind of books they read? Do they read Russian novelists? No. Most of them read Philip Roth and John Updike. And I've just finished translating, and it's coming out, the poems of Louis Gluck, who got the Nobel Prize, the American poet. Yesterday, I actually sent my translation to the publisher the book is going to come out at the beginning of 2021. So they're going to read, Louis Gluck. The way that people dress up, the kind of music they listen, the kind of films, of course, there's also European things, but America is in every house. Okay, for better or for worse, it's here. And you are such a diverse country, so we take the good things and the bad things all together. America is always there, and I think the connection between the Americans and the Greeks is a very strong one. And as I said, there's kind of stupid anti-Americanism, which is stupid exactly because those who are don't see their lifestyles, the way they live, and the way we behave, and what kind of culture we consume. Okay.
Would you say that in terms of the modern Greek state, the country, that I'm sure there's still divisions like anything else and anywhere, but would you say it's the most united as it's ever been? Or do you still think there's a lot more room to grow?
No, yeah. It's not. No, it's not united, unfortunately. I don't think that the country is divided as much as America is at the moment. I think America is actually facing a huge crisis. It's not as divided, but I think what in America you call bipartisanship is very, very difficult in Greece. We don't have a tradition of bipartisan. Even in foreign policy, we don't have that tradition. At least in America, in certain issues, big things, you find that sometimes this works. It hasn't worked in the last years, and I don't know if it's going to work for the next 4 years after these divisions we're talking about. But I wouldn't say that Greek society is at the moment pretty much united. I think there are certain issues that have been resolved. The Macedonian question has been resolved. The name of this state that for decades was unresolved, I think that has finished. And I think that nobody actually questions now our membership in the European Union. But the political system is still, there's a lot of toxic element in the political system, a lot of toxic, and people waste a lot of energies, fighting against each other for secondary and, unimportant issues just to gain an inch in the kind of political power. I think Greece, it's a very divided society, and also something that you don't have in America, which we have here. We still have terrorism. We are the only country in Europe that still has terror. I mean, in America, you have kind of the fear of ISIS terrorism, Islamic terrorism. But in Greece, we have terrorism, Greek terrorism, which still, we thought that when November 17 was arrested, that would have been the end of the story, but it hasn't been the end of the story. So we have a lot of crime, political crime, politically motivated crime in Greece.
And do you see that changing going forward in terms of, or do you see that's always going to be, unfortunately, a part of the, part of the society?
I think that, no, I don't think it's going to disappear quickly. I think it's going to be part of society. It's also the history of Greece, because of the civil war and all the things that the civil war left behind, and then the junta period, and the way that the left identifies itself, and the left behaves. Again, we lost an opportunity because the left came to power for the first time a few years ago. And again, there were expectations of how the left will actually rule Greece. But in many ways, it was a great disappointment. So, and also don't forget that we have in Greece, in Europe, Greece has a Communist Party which has Stalinist origins. And that's also a bizarre phenomenon. So we have terrorism of the left and terrorism of the right. Golden Dawn. That's also a success story. We got rid of Golden Dawn. That's a great success story. Finally, Golden Dawn is in jail, and that kind of fascist party that operated in Greece for so many years. It's I hope, I don't know, because they're going to come out in 4 or 5 years. I don't know. Temporarily, they have been, they lost their kind of power, their power base, but I don't know. But that's, at the moment, I'm very happy that this is the situation. But again, you see, as I said, you have a Stalinist Communist Party, you have the extreme right until very recently, you have, so there is polarization in Greek society, unfortunately.
Probably would you say is probably the greatest learning experience or turning point of the modern Greek state? Was it going from more of a monarchy control to a republic, having your own parliament? You almost answered my the question. I think the great moment is that two things. First of all, Greece became a republic, and the interventions of the army have come to an end. So that these are very important achievements. If you look back and see what kind of turmoil the king and the monarchy in Greece and the army have created, these problems are left behind. And I think that the great success story, I think I said it, is that despite all the divisions and the collisions and the cleavages and all that, the democratic process works. And I think that's also a great success story. Okay, so in that sense, democracy works, despite all the problems that, as you say, all countries have their own problems. Italy has an extreme right-wing party. France has an extreme right-wing party, Le Pen. In Hungary is ruled by an extreme right guy. So when, Greece has, of course, Golden Dawn, but Golden Dawn was not the only extreme right-wing party, in Europe. We had many extremes. So we live in times where democracy is questioned. We have the rise of populism. We have, the Oxford Dictionary introduced a new term a few years ago, a term called post-truth. We live in times of post-truth in the sense that, this idea of fake news that everybody uses
it's something that discredits the political system. And so, people don't trust politicians anymore. They don't trust journalists. They don't trust the press. And so anybody who presents himself and begins to lie in the most successful way, he can have a great political career, as we saw in America and in Greece and in other countries as well.
Of course. Well, this has been great. We've run the end of our time, Dr. Vlavianos. So really wanted to thank you for walking us through. I know we covered a lot of information, but I think you've definitely provided us with some good insight into the evolution of the modern Greek state. A lot of things that we weren't aware of, or some of the things that were happening that unfortunately don't make the history books, let's say, but certainly there are a lot of proud moments. And I think the more that the Greek diaspora has a better sense of obviously what you're teaching and to your students, but also having a better understanding of what Greece went through, I think brings us much closer as a community, as a society. So again, thank you very much on behalf of the NHS. And thank you very much for joining us. And thank you. And thank you again. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I want to wish you a wonderful Christmas, and thanks to the New Year. Blessings. And we look forward to our next NHS Talks discussion. Thank you.